As we mark Refugee Week in Australia this week, there's never been a more appropriate time to reflect on our nation's treatment of refugees and our role in contributing to the conditions that create them in the first instance. For decades, Australia has treated people seeking asylum with naked brutality and inhumanity. It came to a head with Howard's response to the 2001 Tampa affair, a legacy Labor governments have too eagerly run with, including with the decision to reinstate offshore detention 10 years ago. We are still in the midst of this dark chapter of our history, just as many people seeking refuge in Australia are still in the midst of their own darkness. Around 80 people who are under our care offshore are abandoned in PNG, while hundreds here have no path to permanent safety. Meanwhile, successive Australian governments continue to court, engineer and engage in the global conflicts that create refugees. They shun their duty to act on the runaway climate change that creates refugees. Their complicity is almost as staggering as their hostility. This Refugee Week, as we do every week, we renew our calls for Australia's monstrous refugee policy to be thrown in the dumpster of history where it belongs, to make amends with those we have mistreated, and to finally set right a horrific wrong. To our Sudanese community, the outbreak of violence in Sudan has been nothing short of a tragedy. Whilst countries rush to evacuate their citizens, the Australian Greens want to extend solidarity with the people of Sudan left behind, desperately seeking an exit route towards a democratic nation themselves. We also extend our thoughts to the families of the diaspora here in Australia, painfully waiting to hear of news from their families in Sudan. The Australian government must immediately ensure that urgent humanitarian assistance is provided and explicitly calls for peace and a return to civilian rule. We must urgently evacuate Australian Sudanese, and the government must call for humanitarian corridors and medical supplies to be accessible. Sudanese Australians also ask that the Australian government speak to the Sudanese embassy in Australia and condemn the people responsible for these atrocities. My team and I have had the privileged opportunity of meeting with members of the Sudanese community in Perth and from across the country. They are compassionate, resilient, and deserving of their safety and well-being, and we will continue to support and advocate for the community. In solidarity and strength, Jordon.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm situated, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Yewin, and I am the co-president of Amnesty International WA. Amnesty stands in solidarity with the people of Sudan, and I am honoured to have been invited here to speak tonight on such an important issue. There are people at this event today that are much better placed than I am to talk about the current political environment and struggles in Sudan. So I won't be touching too much on the politics today. Instead, I'd like to talk about the incredible display of people power and grassroots action we have seen from the people of Sudan in their fight for their democratic rights. And now, the people of Sudan have shown extraordinary bravery in their fight against the military. The military has used brute force to suppress protesters. They shoot at people with live rounds and tear gas canisters. They arrest and torture people. And yet, every day, the brave people of Sudan turn out in protest to fight for their democratic rights. But what makes this such an extraordinary display of people power to me is that the Sudanese people have been able to protest and stand up to their oppressors without the tools that are normally used or available to other protest movements around the world. Protesters in Sudan have infrequent access to social media and the internet, often for weeks at a time. And secondly, they do not respond to the violence inflicted upon them with violence of their own. And despite facing excessive and often lethal force, the people of Sudan continue to protest in peace. Many organisations, Amnesty included, have commented on these incredible peaceful demonstrations. But police forces have fired tear gas at protesters. They have fired live ammunition into crowds. They beat and torture people. Hospitals that have treated people injured in these protests have reported recovering expansive bullets from wounds. And these are bullets that are designed to expand or flatten on impact, causing much more severe damage than a normal bullet. The use of these particular bullets is considered a war crime by the International Criminal Court, and that's what the Sudanese people are up against. And so these protesters are facing a brutally violent regime, and yet they do not respond in kind. They make their protests and marches as peaceful and as organised as possible, because the people of Sudan know that the military wants them to mess up. The military wants them to be disorganised. They want them to be violent because it would legitimise and justify the military's own use of force. I believe many, many more people would have lost their lives if protesters had responded to violence with violence. And the people of Sudan know this. And so they turn out every day to marches and protests organised through word of mouth in the local neighbourhoods and through flyers dropped off by motorbike, and they march peacefully in the streets in the face of extreme violence. Because the people of Sudan have been here before, and they know exactly what they need to do to have their voices heard. They are driven by a passion for their country and the hope of a better future. And imagine what can be achieved if they had the backing of the international community too. And so it's time the international community stood up and took action alongside the people of Sudan. And they must take concrete action, including targeted sanctions on individuals that are implicated in these serious human rights abuses and war crimes. But no one should underestimate the bravery of the Sudanese people risking their lives for change. The people of Sudan protest, they disrupt, and they make their voices heard without the help of social media and without responding to violence with violence. It's truly some of the most incredible displays of grassroots organising and people power we have seen in any civil war. But it does not have to just be left up to people power. That's why it's time the international community joins the people of Sudan in their fight for their rights to choose who governs their country, to help increase the refugee intake into Australia, and to help them find a new home here if they wish. And so Amnesty International will always continue to stand with the brave people of Sudan. Thank you.